head office didn't even know where we were half the time or what we were planning to send. We'd send documentaries, we'd send news stories. We had enormous leeway. That American reporters used to look at me and say, I can't believe this.
I'm Michael Tamblyn. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the journalist Brian Stewart. Over a career which spanned decades, he covered the U.S.-Iraq Gulf War, famine in Ethiopia, Canada in Afghanistan, and countless other historical events for the CBC and NBC. He tells us all about it, including what life was like off camera, in a new book, On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. Brian Stewart, welcome to Kobo.
Well, thanks very much. It's lovely to be here.
The first chapter of your book, On the Ground, drops us right into the middle of a story. You are in Ethiopia in 1984 as famine is gripping the country, covering it for the CBC. Describe to me what you were seeing on the ground in the north of Ethiopia and the significance of that situation as the opening of your story.
Well, CBC was the first network into that area, along with the BBC. There were two of us. That area had been kept, the media had been kept out of northern Ethiopia because the government didn't want to show off the famine that was raging in its north, where there was a civil war as well. We managed to get our way in. I thought I was ready for what I would see. I wasn't. It was a scene I remember commenting at the time, this is like the world after a nuclear holocaust. The roads were crammed with people. There was the starving at the gates of every town, along every road, the corpses. There was the dust blowing across the landscape. It really looked like either something wildly medieval or after a nuclear holocaust of some kind. And I think the thing that most hit our eyes that we couldn't prepare for was the absolute tragedy of it all, the sadness, the people who had really done nothing to ever hurt anybody. And they were just being pulverized by the worst situation in the world.
And in breaking that story, in capturing really 4 or 5 minutes of footage that could be sent back to headquarters in Toronto, you broke open a story that really changed the entire conversation around and introduced people to the situation in Ethiopia. Like the impact was that great.
Yes, it really was. A historian of that period has likened it to a tsunami hitting Canada. It was a shock wave. It broke on November the 1st, 1984. Much of the country was in watching that newscast on their TVs. The Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who was just newly in office, he was watching with his family. His family were in tears. Stephen Lewis, who was Canada's ambassador to the UN, they were watching. He was watching with his family. They were all in tears. The country really was in shock and tears. Over in Britain, by the way, the BBC was having a very similar effect on people. They had the first, but we had, in a way, the most graphic because they were there for a day and a half. And we were there for days upon days. And we're going to stay for weeks. So it changed everything in Canada. And what was novel about the Canadian experience, if I go right into that, was that where in Britain, Geldof and musicians and aid groups got together behind relief of famine in Ethiopia. In Canada, it was actually a world leader because it was the government in partnership with the people that really led the situation. Mulroney called up Stephen Lewis exactly the next morning and said, Stephen, were you watching CBC The National last night? And he said to the Prime Minister, yes, Prime Minister, I was, and I hope you were going to ask me to do what I think you're going to ask me to do.
Mm-hmm.
Mulroney says, yes, you know what to do. Go down to the United Nations, raise hell, get the world on side to survive, to saving Ethiopia and others in Africa that are also facing starving now. So while other governments like the United States and Britain and many of the European ones didn't really want to have much more to do with Ethiopia because it was the Marxist regime, Canada sort of took the lead, not only in giving by the government, but certainly giving by the public of Canada. and also by lobbying other countries to get involved. And that was a role that Canada played. I always thought it was the shining moment of Canadian foreign policy. It was a spectacular moment.
And this particular setting, yourself, a journalist, a someone shooting video, a sound person, a producer, um, moving from village to village, trying to pull the story together that would then galvanize a nation, seems to represent a particular peak. Was this in a way television news at the peak of its influence, where a single story really could change the entire social conversation in a country?
I think you got it exactly right, because the mid 80s were a time when a revolution in television had been taking place. Satellites had come along. Videotape gave a more immediate feel to a story than the old film did. With film, it took days to get a story back. Suddenly, we were in this world where we could get a story out of Africa in the morning and it would play that night in Canada or anywhere in the world we could get to satellites. And this, because of this immediacy, uh, first of all, we could feed the direst situations that were happening right into the living rooms of Canada. And also, people were able to see horror of the likes they really hadn't seen looking live before. It was just horrific images. And it's funny. Television changed the decade, and there were shocks like this. Uh, if you add together the British shock with it and Live Aid and all the things they got involved with, up until that point, the 80s have been known as kind of the age of greed. You remember the film Wall Street that came out just before the 80s began. It was seen to be a time of, Thatcherism, Reaganism. They thought Mulrooneyism, they were wrong there. But they really thought it was an age of greed. Ethiopia was a pile driver of emotion really across the world. And money was raised, but not only the money, huge amounts of money that nobody anticipated. But before that, there hadn't been that many aid groups. There were handfuls of them here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly there was this explosion of tens of thousands, first tens of thousands, then literally hundreds of thousands of these humanitarian aid groups that spread across the world. And that helped change the whole atmosphere of, of the decade and the time, because it put increasing pressure on governments to respond before these things ran out of hand like this. I mean, yes, there's going to be poverty in Africa. We knew that, but a famine should be able to be stopped. A famine is almost always a man-made event that should have been stopped in its tracks. But the world came out of the 80s, I think, largely thanks to television news. At that time, much more realistic about the dangers facing the world and the problems facing it. Interesting, Joe Clark, who was External Affairs Minister, he flew into Ethiopia. He was the first foreign minister of any country to go in from the West, because, again, it was the Marxist regime. Canada took the lead. We went in there. Clark gave an absolute shock of energy and vibrancy to all the delegates there who were feeling terribly pessimistic. And he said, Canada's behind you. Canada's involved in this. Other countries are coming. On the way out, a reporter stopped Clark on the way to the plane and asked him, what caused all this? What was responsible for this? And he said, television.
Mm-hmm.
That was the thing that was changing government the way we saw it.
And in front of that camera is what's maybe the most romantic of all figures in the profession of journalism, you, the foreign correspondent. And was this also a way, kind of a peak for the profession for a correspondent, where we see that you playing that particular role, not just, the person that's out in the field, but backed by the resources of a network, willing to send reporters and crews into the field and keep them there developing a story. Was it also the peak of that job in a way?
It was, in some ways, the golden age of foreign correspondent work, really through the late 70s into the 80s and right up into the 90s. There was a period where, yes, It really was hugely influential. Networks thought were competitive. They thought that, hey, we should get involved in this. So they started sending crews around the world. Uh, it took on a little bit of the glamour. There's no get around it, but covering Beirut and the war and the Gulf War and all of that had a certain glamour at the time to it. And it really was a time when Canada got in a big time. We talk in sports about owning the podium. Before the 1982, when the CBC went into a growth period, Canada was really not that strongly represented overseas among the foreign correspondents, doing alliances with networks, breaking big stories of that. By the mid to late 80s, we were right up there in the top 5 or 6. And that, I think Canadians were aware that we were all over the place, and Canada was doing a quite good job. And because the Americans kept hiring Canadian correspondents, the Canadians consumed, there must be some quality there. Often they were hiring us just to get our passports, so we could travel easier. But to be honest about it, but yeah, we were pretty good because we had come up well trained. We had good farm systems and TV at that time, and we were ready for the challenges that came. And yeah, it was a powerful moment for the profession.
And so you've shown us a moment in time for media. It was also a humanitarian moment, a geopolitical moment. And then we go back in time. Your father worked for Simpsons, the UK department store.
That's right. Yeah.
And as a young man, your family moved between Canada and the UK before you came back to Canada at the end of the 1950s. So you experienced English newspapers, the BBC, and the connection that Canada and Britain had at that time. And it seems like we forget how culturally linked English Canada and the UK were, in the years after the Second World War and into the 1950s. But when you came back to Canada, Canada itself was changing. There was the beginning of Canada starting to think about itself as its own culture. And I'm wondering if that was something you were conscious of in the moment that you were in it.
Well, I remember just before we came back from the school in England, and the teachers and the rest of it were always kind of dismissing Canada as a very nice, tremendous good ally in the war, but not very consequential at peace. Like you say, well, what about Pearson? And what about our blue helmeted peacekeepers? I was sort of the Mr. Canada voice running around the school, but it didn't get a lot of traction. But just before I came back, Diefenbaker had swarmed into Canadian politics, and the British had taken note. This is really strange. Out of nowhere comes this politician sort of from the West, and they began to talk about Diefenbaker. I knew coming back, and I sailed back in the old last of the liner years, coming back in the old-fashioned way and all that. I had some realization that Canada was really changing. And when I got to Toronto in 1958, which happened to be the year it grew most of any modern year, including recent ones, it was just exploding at the seams. A new life was taking place. There was a kind of excitement in Toronto, but there was also at the same time a very heavy hand of conventionality and the church and on Sundays there was very little you were actually permitted to do. So there was this strange mix of dynamism and conservatism and sort of rigidity of social mores and stuff like that to contend with. I was quite confused, let us say, for several
Mhm.
years. But most youth in that period, I think, were confused.
It seems from your description of your early years that the seeds of wanting to be a journalist were there almost from the beginning. But no one who was teaching you or advising you seemed to think much of journalism as a career. Uh, was it safe to say that no one was holding this job up in front of you and saying this is absolutely where you should be going?
Absolutely not. If I ever thought of journalism, because I would like to be a sports writer sitting in Ebbets Field or Yankee Stadium with a little press pass in my hat, but that was
Mhm.
a passing glance. So in 1956, when I was going to school in England, England, France, and Israel invaded the Egyptian Canal, and there was a giant sort of war underway. And at the same time, Hungary rose up. Many older listeners like myself will certainly remember that period, the
Hmm.
tension in the air and the rest of it. And I was watching on television at that time, limited though it was, and seeing these guys run around and do all these jobs and be right there. What I thought, gee, history's been made, but these people are in the middle of it and they seem to be paid to go there. And yet I didn't really think of risking all that. So I decided at the age of 14, when I grew up, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I remember telling my parents that and getting blank looks like, what? And then going to school and the English masters and saying, when we have these little essays, what are you going to be when you grow up? I wrote, when I grow up, I want to be a foreign correspondent, covering history in the making. And they all looked at me like the guy's gone nuts. Who would do that job? They're crazy people. And that really was the ambition I got, and I never really wavered from it. That was what I wanted to do all my working life until I was too old to do it.
For your first job, you had to choose between a TV station in Sudbury and a print reporting position at the Oshawa Times. Looking back, is that one of those crossroad moments where everything could have taken a completely different path?
Absolutely. I guess we all have them, don't we? We have
Hmm.
that moment where I used to tell journalism students that my biggest break in life was not so much the jobs I got, it was the jobs I didn't get. Uh, or, it was the jobs I failed to get or chose not to get, go after. And yes, if I'd gone to that, I would have ended up, Lord knows what, TV, but certainly not a foreign correspondent. I chose to go into print as the quickest way to get overseas in print for 9 years as a print reporter. But it did dawn on me in print that I loved newspapers. Absolutely was heaven on earth for me as an environment. But I did realize it's not the fastest way to become a foreign
Hmm.
correspondent. And so in later years in Montreal, when CBC came to me to do a supper show, I said, well, maybe this will lead me down the path towards becoming a foreign correspondent. That's what drove me on. It certainly wasn't love of TV. It certainly wasn't ambition of it to be in front of the lens. I was petrified.
After a sojourn in Europe, you joined the Montreal Gazette at the beginning of one of the most tumultuous times in Quebec and Canadian politics. You were there for de Gaulle's Vive le Québec Libre speech, for the rise of Trudeau mania, the rise of the FLQ, just keystone moments in Canadian history. And distance in time creates perspective. Sort of history is a great filter. Were there was there anything looking back that seemed momentously important at the time that has faded in hindsight? Is there anything that kind of stuck out to you as we thought this was going to be a big deal and it ended up not passing that test of history?
Uh, Not quite sure I can give a clear answer to that. All
Mm-hmm.
the events seem big to me, like my centennial year, 1967. That's when I came back from a 2-year stint in Europe working for a paper. And I just thought, oh, wow, the whole world wants to come to Montreal. And
Hmm.
then I got into a kind of social life in Montreal. I said, certain cities have certain decades, like New York in the 20s, Rome in the 50s, the
Hmm.
60s, sure. And I just come from London in the 60s, swinging London. But I thought Montreal, Canada has got to be the place to be in the 60s. So I saw a lot of things happening. De Gaulle's big speech would probably had less effect than I thought it would have at the time, but it did stir up a lot of separatism. The separatist wave was a fascinating story to cover, to say the least, and a hair-raising one often.
Hmm.
Um, but basically, no, I think the 60s, I was on the flight with Trudeau. I think I was the first reporter to use the term Trudeau mania. I thought that would be, a major change, but in many ways, it was a major change. So it seemed to be the 60s had a unique capacity to keep coming up with really important events, whether it be in music, whether it be in politics, whether it be in clothes and fashion.
Yeah.
It was one of those decades where things stuck to the wall when they were thrown against it.
You made the switch from the Gazette to the CBC, from print to television, and eventually from Montreal via Toronto to Ottawa. And in each of these moves, you're trying to get closer and closer to that idea of a foreign posting, of being that foreign correspondent. And in each, in each interview you're having with a potential employer, they're telling you, well, you do a few years here and you just wait, you're going to get your foreign correspondent position. Did you ever waver in that goal, or was that the destination all the way along?
Though that was the destination. Now,
Hmm.
mind you, I thought I'd have a lot of fun in the interim while I was working my way towards it. I
Hmm.
thought I had an awful lot to learn. But in Ottawa, I got caught up in the tremendous thrill of covering politics at that time. I was there in the parliament the very first day it was televised. There were scandals to break, investigative reporting. I became an investigative reporter for quite a while, and I broke some very major stories involving the RCMP.
Hmm.
And some people said, you should really get into this full time. And I did several more, but I never felt I was, going to be a great investigative reporter. I thought it was a good one, but I always kept this dream of getting that foreign posting. And fortunately, Ottawa was a perfect place. Develop your talents for what they're worth and start covering things like foreign affairs, Canadian foreign affairs, and embassies
Hmm.
and foreign dues, and Canada and South Africa, over apartheid, and Canada in the Middle East, those kind of things. I was doing them from Ottawa. And it was just a wonderful background. I had several years of this. So I was studying a lot, really taking it seriously. So by the time when the first foreign trips came, I really did feel ready for it.
And tell me about that first assignment where you really are working as a foreign correspondent. What was what were the first stories you were working on?
They very cleverly, the CBC sent me down sort of like outings, early outings of the rookie, say to cover a papal visit to Mexico, the first visit by Pope John Paul II, outside of Rome, the Vatican, to Mexico. An amazingly big story for Latin American religion at the time. Then I covered depression in Brazil and also in Chile, trips, long road trips and things like that, all the while just working on the capacity. How do you work with people in the field? How do you keep yourself fit? How do you
Hmm.
keep your stress under control, your nerves under control, all of that. And then it was 1982, they said, okay, that was a big test. And they sent me to discover a war in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Nicaragua was somewhat settled, but still had a war going on. But El Salvador was in the midst of an absolutely brutal, indescribably vicious civil war. And that was a tremendous emotional, mental shock for me to get around and to understand this is what you're going to be running into as a foreign correspondent. Don't have any illusions. It's all going to be fun, which I didn't. But you talk about covering wars. It's time you really saw what a war was. And, you're starting to see your bodies in the streets and stuff like that on a daily occurrence.
And aside from you're seeing a humanitarian crisis, you're seeing a geopolitical crisis, but who's showing you the ropes? Who's telling you how to keep yourself safe and move around in an environment like that so that you can get home to file the story?
Well, we obviously, I work with a producer who had some more
Mhm.
experience, and my crew actually was quite experienced. They had been in several very hot spots. So you got your own little crew, but then you're really relying upon members of the media that sort of help you out. Like you're going up and asking, look, we want to get down south where we understand you might get in contact with the rebels. And he'll turn around and say, we want to use this highway. And the person will turn around, you're out of your mind. You
Mhm.
do not do that kind of stupid stuff. New people come in and then they give the classic dressing down of the new rookie. You stupid can jerks come in here. You think you can do anything you want. You're going to go down somewhere, get yourself and the crew killed. And of course, unfortunately, the same person who told me that was killed 2 years later himself on that very same road. But you're learning bit by bit by bit. There isn't
Mhm.
really a manual to follow. There
Mhm.
certainly wasn't that. There isn't kind of here's what you do on day one as a foreign correspondent, or here's how you talk yourself out of the roadblock that scares you to death. Because an awful lot of journalists and other religion and people and activists and religious people have been killed being stopped at roadblocks. or disappeared or never seen again. We weren't really taught how to do that. We had a journal crew that was put up against a wall and put under a mock execution. Nobody teaches you how to handle that kind of thing. So it's learning on the ground bit by bit and talking a lot to the old veterans. And the old veterans really are very wise and can learn a lot that way.
Your chapter about the first Gulf War is in many ways a perfect example of what's become a struggle for more and more news organizations, how you work with and around governments and their militaries. You found creative ways to get your story in that war. And that seemed like a preview of the increasing sophistication with which militaries manage the media and access to battlefields. How how did that change for you over your career as you started as a foreign correspondent to as you were covering in Afghanistan in 2010s?
Well, when I first started in, it was easy flow. It was a bit like Vietnam, back then, before my time, journalists could hop on helicopters and fly around and go to different parts of the battlefield. What really skewered it in many ways was the Falklands War, where the British decided to put the journalists all with one military unit. And they became more power than the powerless troopers, for heaven's sakes, in their enthusiasm. So after that, all the militaries learned a lot from that. And by the Gulf War, you could go to the front under this strictly controlled pool or that pool. And the ones, of course, the biggest armies like the British and the French and the Americans were the ones that took all their own reporters and left the rest to the side. And poor old Canada, which had done a lot there, that sent destroyers over and a whole squadron of planes, we were given nowhere near the pool. So we had to maneuver our way around, doing whatever deals we could make to get up to the front line and see this extraordinary buildup of American military might that was going to throw the Iraqis out of Kuwait, all that. And eventually we were so discouraged by this. So we got together with a bunch of these international groups and said, look, the Americans will never give us help, never take us seriously unless we come up with our own press association. So instantly, it took us about 10 minutes, we invented something like the International Foreign Correspondence Mobile Unit 1, something, whatever, that I forget the name of it. And we went running to them and they sort of said, oh, wow, I guess you got us. And they gave us 2 school buses, which we could go on, get on, and drive off to the front on our own. And this is when the war is suddenly dramatically shifting, and the Americans and Arab units and British and French were driving into Kuwait and driving Americans for Kuwait City. And we just happened to pull out just when this was all sort of breaking loose, because nobody was paying much attention to us. We ended up actually getting into Kuwait City before most of the Americans or anyone else did. So, I mean, it was a completely wild and bad cap sort of event. But it did teach me, from now on, you're going to have to be doing an awful lot of diplomacy, of bargaining, and whatever to get yourself around to see what you have to see.
So, how did that experience in the first Gulf War compare to covering Afghanistan, especially like the second time you were there in 2010? How had that relationship between military and media evolved during that time?
Well, it only got stricter. There was one important thing I would mention on the Gulf War. I really felt badly that Canada was not getting, for all its major player as a NATO member and a major participant in this whole enterprise, Canada just wasn't to be taken seriously. The Canadian media wasn't. So we had to form our own elements, and we stuck to that practice from then on.
Mm-hmm.
But when we got to Afghanistan, everybody was divided up into their own national units. Canadians went in with Canadians, the French went in with French, British with British. I thought that was a very unfortunate, extremely unfortunate situation for everybody. For the media, it meant they only saw their own troops, and they didn't really have a wide picture of the war. For the military, it means they didn't have to worry about awkward questions being asked by other journalists. And it really sort of put a blanket over a lot of the coverage of the Afghanistan war, which I thought was very unfortunate. was left Canadians being underinformed, even though we have some excellent war correspondents in this country.
Mhm.
We don't have enough of them, and we certainly didn't have enough for that conflict.
Was that intentional in terms of keeping the picture of the conflict segmented, or was that just the natural pull of Canadians want to hear Canadian stories and British audiences want to hear British stories?
Totally intentional.
Okay.
Totally intentional. What the military commanded, I actually happen to get to know a few of the main officers working in the headquarters of NATO and discussed all these press assignments and that. They realized, and again, going back to that Falklands War example, they realized that if you put reporters with one military unit or a group, they tend to get very fond of that group. I mean, we're actually reporters in military get on really quite well on a personal level.
Mhm.
And, you get yourself into a kind of garrison state. So that's where everybody wanted their reporters from their country to be in their own little garrison state. So they report back, highly positive, highly, use the term gung-ho kind of stories. And I think that was right off from the bat, the determination to do that. And then once on the ground, of course, we couldn't go out beyond the main Kandahar camp. We couldn't go out there without military guides and really a lot of military. We went with the military. You're always going around with them. You're seen very little of on your own in the public. It was frankly too dangerous often to go out. Extremely dangerous, actually, in terms of being kidnapped and things like that. So it led to a kind of suffocating atmosphere, I thought, that really did not do a good job for the media, for Canada, or for the military.
In all of your stories about going out in the field with the CBC, you described the CBC budgets as always being tight, that you were always trying to try to make do with the resources that were available. How different was your experience as a Canadian journalist to what a foreign correspondent from a major US network or journalists from other countries would experience?
Well, I worked for a U.S. network for a little while, about a year and a half, and
Hmm.
the CBC really always had to watch its budget very carefully. However, in the 80s and 90s, that budget was loosened up a good deal indeed.
Hmm.
Part of it was the growth of the Journal as a current affairs show inside the CBC, and that got bigger and bigger budgets. So we had that period where we were up there really competitive, but we weren't into renting the private planes to fly crews around the way the Americans did. We didn't have the limos picking us up in the morning to drive us off to this and that. But we were doing pretty well. I mean, what was striking for my experiences in Africa was the leeway, though, that the CBC got. The reporters for CBC compared to the Americans, me and my producer Tony Berman and our crew, we were today you might go in for 5 days, do a few stories and get out. We were in for weeks, 6 weeks at a
Mm.
time. The head office didn't even know where we were half the time or what we were planning to send. We'd send documentaries, we'd send news stories. We had enormous leeway that American reporters used to look at me and say, I can't believe this. Why on earth would anyone ever leave the CBC and come here where you're slavery kind of thing in terms of control? Um, so the CBC was short on cash, and that became a real major problem
Mhm.
in later years. But at the time, we were flourishing, and at the time, we had a freedom, I think, of expression and what to cover. And we didn't have to worry all the time what was going to influence the White House or American foreign policy. We could look at what it influences the EU or the Canadian foreign policy. So we had a great freedom in that sense.
As your career advances, you get a chance to produce documentaries, a very different focus than breaking news, digging into events for a truth that hasn't been fully revealed. How much did you have to change up your mindset as a journalist when you started working with that wider lens?
Very much so. There's a considerable thing to get over. And I always worked with a producer. I never would have the confidence to have done it myself because there's a degree of organization and big picture seeing that I would be too bogged down by. What I found when I started doing documentaries and writing for documentaries, like almost everybody who does, my writing was not right. And instead of letting a picture tell the story, I was doing the telling of the story with a small amount of picture. So an endless producers would tell me over and over again, look, Brian, you write very nice news stories and you've got tremendous energy in your sentences, but you got to loosen up a bit because we want the pictures here have got to tell a much more major story. And I began to sort of think of it a bit pompously, perhaps, that, you know, news was poetry and documentaries were prose. But it takes a while to get to know that.
And what's the documentary work that you think was where you really hit your stride?
Well, I'd have to say again, it was probably back doing human rights stories in Africa. Um, and not only catastrophes, but I learned in the Ethiopian famine, talking to an aid worker who came up to us once and said, Brian, you news guys are all great rushing in here and doing your stories and then leaving, and you don't hang around in catastrophes to see that people dig themselves out of these crises. And what you feed over and over again are the crises, and then you move on to some other country, some other terrible event. And people are left with this endless impression that, oh, nothing ever happens except for terrible things in that place, and the people will never recover. But in actual fact, I saw with my own eyes, people do recover. Villages do crawl out from under an earthquake or a tsunami, or they begin to come back with some help from even a famine. So I love doing the documentaries that did a little bit of the update on events, but also did, here's what we can show you from Ethiopia now, how they've come back with a bit of world help in the last decade. The schools are open, the universities are booming, the economy is improving. And that gave me a tremendous thrill because then people who are at home and are often given aid or help or sympathy or what have you could say, yeah, maybe it is worthwhile after all. Maybe people do come back from this. And, one of the biggest stories of my time was the bottom billion of people living in abject poverty on $1.20 a day. Over 1 billion people, if you can imagine that figure, barely enough they're in malnutrition. You can't live on $1.20 a day and feed a family on that. Something like 550 million people moved out of that bottom billion in the last decade and a half. And I'm saying, I wish we could do more stories showing the fact that where recovery does take place and where people do come back, and where even after wars, we should go back into post-war situations more often to see, how international agencies work, see how good works get done, and see how people do come around and survive, as Europe did after 1945.
And in the first chapter, you introduced us to Birhan Waldo, who really became the human face of the Ethiopian famine for the Canadians. It was a way for the public to put that crisis that was affecting millions, sort of personalize that. Can you talk a bit about going back to Ethiopia and meeting Birhan again?
Yeah. One of the early days in the family, we drove to this feeding center where the families were just pouring in by the hundreds. Many of the children were malnourished or sick. And I was going down a line of the very badly famished. And I saw this little girl fall over and go quack against the pavement. And I thought, oh my God, she looks like she's about to die. So I turned around and yelled to a nurse who ran forward, picked her up, and rushed her into a tiny little health center. And we ran in with our camera afterwards and we got set up and then we're filming the girl. And the nurse says, she's going to die, unfortunately. There's nothing more we can do with her. She'll be dead within the next 15 minutes. And out of her face was coming this look, almost looking into eternity. That struck me as, my God, this is like Ethiopia looking back on me, all their crushed hopes, all the youth. She was only 3 years old, all the life they'll never have. So we left that room determined to let her at least die in dignity. And I went off with the crew and we filmed around. They bury people in one day in those kind of situations. So we went back later in the day to film her funeral. And I got there and there was this little knot of people smiling. And in the center room was this girl. This girl, I went up and said, what's happened here? And the nurse said, we had a little bit of a miracle today. We gave her a final needle and she came back. This tiny little girl, she was alive in her arms. We rushed her back to the AIDS center. And 3 weeks later, I visited again and she left. I didn't know it, but I would film these remarkable scenes of her in the face of death. She became for me the symbol of if she doesn't die, Ethiopia may not die. She's going to be life after death to a certain extent. Our editor, who he had brought with us to Ethiopia and was working away hour after hour on these horrific films of famine, put together a strip of 2.5 minutes of the worst situation cases of young children, and mothers and fathers and that dying, but ended with a shot of Burhan's face, that incredible face, on the outside and when inside the medical center. And come Live Aid 6 months later, or 7 months later, in June '85, David Bowie runs forward and shows that tape on during Live Aid, saying, if you want to see what this is all about, watch this tape by CBC. And it played, and up to that point, Live Aid had not been getting the money it needed, nor hoped for, or even imagined. It was way short when Burhan's face, and that tape really was shown. The phone lines just caved. They almost melted around the World Guild office. They just exploded. In one day of giving, and this was largely helped by this tape, something like in today's money, $600 million from around the world poured in. That has never been equal before, now or since, and may never again. And that was all due to that remarkable event. The news built up on Ethiopia, and certainly a huge impact of that tape. Years later, I used to think, oh, I wonder what ever happened to that girl. I mean, I was quite haunted almost by her image. So I asked my producer, Tony Berman, once, let's go back and find her. And he said yes, and he sold it to the journal, and Mark Starr was, and I was sent back to try and find her. I didn't expect to find her, but I thought I'd at least do a story that the search will go on and hopefully she's alive. I feared she was dead. So many had died since. And I get there, and about 3 days of looking, we found her. It wasn't nearly as hard as we thought it would be. And there she was. They were brought forward by the local village. And I did an item on her called Life After Death, the survival of Burhan, symbolic of survival of Ethiopia. This is 4 years later. And I made sure the family were well looked after. They were okay looked after. They went to school, got her in school, all her brothers and sisters, got them the house. And I kind of supported them over the years. But while I was doing other works in Ethiopia, I remained in works. And we've remained great friends. He visited the girlfriend, our house in Toronto in the 1990s. I went back there and had dinners with him. And we've now Zoomed each other. This girl from the worst horror of all of Africa, and myself and my family are Zooming with her family. It's just the most remarkable relationship. And she's set up a charity in Ethiopia to help children like herself. They never have to go through the same thing.
Incredible. You have spent time over your career in disaster areas, in war zones, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a specter that appears a few times in the book. And considering what you've witnessed, it seems like it could appear even more often. You worked with the neuropsychiatrist, Dr. Anthony Feinstein, concerning your own experiences. You also helped him expand his search more widely to include other journalists. And so I'm curious, when did that idea of PTSD even start to become a part of the conversation for journalists who are covering conflict areas?
Not until surprisingly late in the 1990s. I basically had a real nervous breakdown. I didn't have PTSD. I was diagnosed with not having that, but I was really bad shape, as many journalists were. A great many foreign correspondents were coming home, fined for 5 years, 10 years. The next thing you know, their whole lives fall apart. Drinking too much, they're having these nightmares, constant nightmares. So I went to him, and he had been and I became the first patient he looked into as to the incidence of PTSD and other mental aberrations and psychological problems faced by foreign correspondents. You figure there must be a lot of studies because they've faced more wars than soldiers do.
Mhm.
Some foreign correspondents go to 20, 25 different wars. I had been to 10, which is kind of a modest almost on the scale. But he found there wasn't a single thing written about the influence of the psychological damage done to foreign correspondents. Networks hadn't studied it. Foreign correspondents hadn't asked it to be studied. And when he studied, he finally got it rolling. And since then, he's built up this tremendous international respect for, and networks are in alliance with them uh, across the way. But as our time went on, I would see him quite often. And time went on, he also noticed, as some others did, that not all foreign correspondents get PTSD. In fact, only about 40% get PTSD because they're self-selected. They go into a
Mhm.
job they think they're very good at, they know the risks, and et cetera, et cetera. They like, I guess, racing cars or something. They're self-selected for the role. But many of them are suffering from something very deeply psychologically distressed, very deeply emotionally distressed, I should say, that had all the symptoms of PTSD, but was something called moral injury. And that
Mm.
term began to emerge I think about a decade ago. And there's more studies of that now. PTSD is a mental illness. Moral injury is what's suffered from people that is a kind of wound to the soul, as Feinstein has called it. It's a kind of spiritual conscience wound that you suffer you can suffer if you're a witness to horrible events. Journalists, soldiers, nurses, doctors, aid workers, the rest of it. And no matter what you do in a way to kind of help, never strikes you as you did enough. And
Mm.
journalists are, I think, particularly prone to that because we go and stare a lot. Now, I go into seeing a hut full of dozens of dying children, mothers holding up kids who have already died, asking for help. I don't know any medicine at that time. My crew doesn't know any medicine. We're doing our job. We're doing what has to be done. And you come out, and hopefully the doctors will save them. Or you're driving along by the side of the road, and you see if more and more and more families with you can't walk much further with young kids. Maybe you could shove several of those families into your van. You're doing everything you think you can be doing, but you're never doing quite enough. And years later, that can really begin to haunt you. And it did haunt me that I could have these flashbacks to a woman with 3 children by the side of the road who could have been maybe saved if we had somehow found a place in our band for her. And, you can go on forever. If we feel that, then
Mm.
there'll be more, then there'll be more, then there'll be more. So it's a kind of guilt feeling you have to work your way out of because it certainly doesn't do any good and it can do an awful lot of harm. So I think moral injury now, and it's not certainly not just journalists, as I say, but
Mm.
it's one of those illnesses of our time, I think, when people witness horrible things and they don't act according to their highest sense of obligation for themselves, their highest sense of morality. And who can? I mean, that's the trouble. I mean, I've known people I know a woman, for heaven's sakes, a woman, a nurse, a very, very famous British nurse who's known as the second Florence Nightingale because of her incredible work with the poor in Ethiopia during the famine and also in Lebanon during the Civil War. And she has that guilt feeling that she never did enough. She never, when can she sleep or eat? Because you have to take a break. So
Mhm.
it can affect very many people. And so Feinstein is certainly working very strongly on this now and lead with the Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto and also the Globe and Mail or this sort of alliance to get standards so the journalists out there in the fields can get a sense whether they perhaps are starting to suffer from PTSD or from moral injury and know more about it.
Mhm. As the saying goes, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. You've seen student activists beaten and arrested by Franco's police in Spain, the authoritarianism of Drapeau, reporting on the abuses of the RCMP in the 1970s, El Salvador in the 1980s. You've seen how democracies can turn into dictatorships or continue as democracies, but find justifications for bad behavior. Having seen some of those situations firsthand, How do you rate today's journalists in covering the authoritarian slides that we're seeing today?
I think they're doing their best. At the same time, everybody is wondering, can this be happening? I mean, until you're kind of in it, you don't quite realize how fast that slide can be and how all embracing it can be. I think they're trying, but it's a very confusing one to do. I think that there has been an enormous effect over the years of making police departments more careful about how they treat people. I mean, quite frankly, beatings of people in station houses were a lot more common back in the 1950s and 60s than they are today. There's been a lot of cleaning up on that. I mean, soldiers in most professional, real, serious armies are really drilled over and over again what they can do and can't do. And they're much more disciplined than 30 years ago. But for the news, it's a never ceasing attempt to bring out to people not only the horrible things that are happening, but to try and explain why one horrible thing could lead to another horrible thing, and a whole bunch of horrible things become part of basically the society. Then before you know it, like Chile was the most amazing thing to see. And I say that, sad-hearted. I mean, here was going along very civil country with democratic politics and the rest of it. The next thing you know, there's a military coup. It sides into a regime of murder of thousands of people, grotesque torture of other thousands of people, and a total police military crackdown on any kind of dissidence whatsoever. And it all happened in the space of a few years. People could hardly believe it, but there it was. The media has to be aware of who are the brave people in society who will stand up, because it could be very discouraging to see how quickly a great majority of people can go very quiet when it's not exactly their interest at stake, but just somebody else's. You need the brave people to speak out.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I have been speaking with Brian Stewart, author of On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. Find it at Kobo and Conversations home on the web, kobo.com/conversation, and check the show notes for a link. Follow us in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, go ahead and tell the news junkie in your life all about it. And if you are a writer or someone who's starting to think about being an author, be sure to seek out our sister podcast, Kobo Writing Life, for everything you could ever possibly want to know about the art and science of being an author. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.